listening to Honestly Aging by Friends Life Care VigR, a podcast where we explore what it's like getting older, the peaks, the valleys, and everything in between. In this season of Honestly Aging by Friends Life Care VigR, we're covering topics related to vibrant aging. I'm your host, Cheryl Proska. Let's grow old together. On today's episode, I'm joined by Jen Newman, Greg Woods, and Brent Walsh from Beacon Hill Friends House. Together, we'll dive into the important topic of vocational discernment. Jen is a Quaker, theologian, writer, activist, and the executive director at Beacon Hill Friends House. She has facilitated more than 100 workshops to diverse ecumenical audiences where she focuses her facilitation on interactive and experiential spaces, using Quaker principles and practices in ways that help audiences connect with their own inner wisdom. Greg is a skilled facilitator and workshop leader with more than 15 years of experience. Currently, he serves as a program consultant for Beacon Hill Friends House, where Jen and he have developed and refined the Living Your Call Vocational Discernment Program. Brent is a certified life coach specializing in relationships and life transitions, and he has contributed to various publications, workshops, and conferences. In his role as program and engagement manager at Beacon Hill Friends House, he strives to strengthen the community with thoughtful programs and help everyone he meets feel seen and heard. Jen, Greg, and Brent, welcome and thank you for being here. How are you all today?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good. Thank you.
I'm doing well, and I'm so glad to have you all. You're all joining me today to talk about vocational discernment, especially as it relates to older adults and Quakerism. I want to share some exciting news for any Friends Life Care members who are listening that Jen, Greg, and Brent are leading a vocational discernment program for Friends Life Care members in 2025. So be on the lookout for that invite, or please reach out to your care coordinator for more information. To kick off the episode, I would like to invite each of you to add anything you'd like to your introductions, as well as if we could define vocational discernment and tell us more about Beacon Hill Friends House. I think I'll invite Jen and then Brent and then Greg. So Jen, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Cheryl. I can start with defining what Beacon Hill Friends House is for folks. The Friends House is a Quaker center for learning and action, as well as a residential community of about 20 people who live according to Quaker values. So we were founded in 1957 in a large mansion home in Beacon Hill in Boston, which is in downtown Boston, to be a place for folks to meet, worship, and learn. So out of that grew a Quaker congregation, Beacon Hill Friends Meeting, that meets here. There have been public programs and lectures and events who are a space for community organizations to gather and work together. And we have an intentional residential community program of about 20 people. And the age range there really varies. For an intergenerational community, right now our youngest resident is in their early 20s, and our oldest resident is newly retired in their 60s, early 70s. And so those folks aren't necessarily all Quaker, but they live according to Quaker values of faith, simplicity, integrity, community, and social responsibility. And we use Quaker business processes, and we use Quaker practices in our life together. That ranges from silence at dinner to exploring Clearness Committees and other ways that friends use to deepen our experience of our inner wisdom and inner teacher. So our mission at the Friends House is to embody those Quaker principles of faith, simplicity, integrity, community, and social responsibility in order to nurture and call forth the light in all of us. And we do that through those various means. And I have been the executive director here for about a year and a half. I was the program manager, Brent's role, before that, and I moved in as a resident in my early 20s. And so that's a little bit more about Beacon Hill Friends House and my relationship to it. I'm wondering if Greg wants to talk a little bit about what vocational discernment means, or if you'd like me to take that one too.
I'd love to hear from Greg, please.
I so vocational discernment is about finding your life calling. Usually when we hear the term vocation, we think of a career or uh, a career path or job training, but the way we see it in a more holistic term, uh, vocation as calling. And sometimes a calling can line up with a job, like Jen, her ministry and her work lines up with what she does. But for me, right now, I work in IT, I work with data, and that is a job, but my vocation is still in ministry. I like doing these workshops, or I am really involved in my church here in Minneapolis as I am on the preaching team. So my vocation doesn't line up with my career path. And with older adults, uh, sometimes older adults, when they retire from their career, they don't know what their next calling is. And so we want to help people in that age range really discern what can they do now with their with that part of their lives, because people are living longer, and um so um a lot of they still have a lot some industry and some motivation to still give back. And sometimes people don't know how to do that or need direction because they got a lot more times than they used to. And so we hope to help them find their vocation in that season of their life.
I just want to thank you for that explanation and providing the personal example, Greg, where while your career is in IT and data, your calling, or you feel like perhaps more your vocation is in doing vocational discernment, facilitation, leading people in helping to guide people in a path that would help them discern their own calling. So that example helped crystallize it for me, and I wanted to thank you for it. Jen, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to share that one of the guiding quotes that we use to help think about what we mean by vocation is actually not from a Quaker, but from a theologian and Presbyterian minister, Frederick Buechner, who wrote that the place God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. And I'm thinking about that when I hear Greg, for example, explain where his vocation is, example, that there are moments in our lives where we're called to these places where our deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. And that might mean being on the preaching team at church, or that might mean, serving in a particular way within a nonprofit organization. That could be different from where you get your paid work. And so as folks transition out of a paid work situation and into a retirement situation, thinking about the moments where you really came alive. And that's one of the other quotes that we use is from Howard Thurman, who I believe was a Methodist minister. Greg can correct me if I'm wrong on that, who said that your vocation in life is really what makes you come alive, and what we need is people who have come alive. And so we look for where are those moments where you have come alive? And you can see Greg light up, I think, or hear it around being involved in church or being involved in these other places or involved in this curriculum. And so you can sort of know those signs for yourself of where do I find that? And then how can I find that outside of maybe the traditional structures of a career or job? And I think in retirement, especially, those outside of traditional structures can be really important to look for and to figure out what you want to nourish. And so those are some of the things that we bring into to our understanding.
Brent, what might you like to add about why you find it's important for older adults to engage in vocational discernment?
Yeah, I have found in my work with folks in various life stages of transition, um, I I am drawn to this conversation because throughout our lives, transition serves a very important uh, part in our evolution as just as human beings in general. And what it does, transition disrupts the status quo. We just start thinking we know who we are, and then suddenly we are hit with a life transition that maybe we were expecting, maybe we weren't expecting, and it completely rocks our foundation and it disrupts the status quo and it forces us to re-examine our identity and who we are and what that means about what our future holds for us. And so even though aging is something that we all kind of expect, when it actually happens, we discover things about ourselves that we didn't know existed, or we discover certain vulnerabilities that we didn't know we had, or we discover certain areas of strength and confidence that we didn't realize we had. And so, nevertheless, even though we're learning all of these wonderful things about ourselves, or sometimes scary things about ourselves, that disruption of the status quo can be very scary. And sometimes it's not even about knowing all the answers. We don't even know all the questions. We don't know the questions we're supposed to ask about, like, what is happening and why am I feeling this way about it? And so vocational discernment, in my opinion, is really important to being able to not only come up with some answers, but also to distill the questions down to like the fundamental core questions. And that is something that as people move into new stages of life, including retirement, um, dealing with that loss of identity or that shift in identity by figuring out like what are the good questions to ask and how can I come to terms with my new reality.
Could we move into the Quaker approach to vocational discernment? And for anyone listening who's not a Friends Life Care member, I do want to say that Friends Life Care is a Quaker values nonprofit organization. So that is why we are focusing on this specific approach to vocational discernment.
Yeah, I can start there. I think we root how we understand vocational discernment in the Quaker concept that there's an inner teacher or an inner wisdom in all of us. And so I think part of our curriculum or how we were thinking about this developed when Greg and I, in January of 2020, were thinking about how to provide some opportunities for young adults.
Mm.
And in the current college environment, for example, a lot of how do we know what we're supposed to do next in our lives is answered through what do other people say we need to do? How do I market myself? How do I take the right assessment that will tell me what I'm suited for? How do I take all the right steps to be the person that the job market wants me to be? And not a lot of focus on how do I understand what my right next step is? How do I understand what's true or real for me, even if what someone else's advice is really different from what I think I should do? And so how do I cultivate trust in myself? How do I learn to listen? What's the difference between an inner teacher and an inner critic? How do
Mm.
we, hear about or how do we listen to that part of ourselves and trust and learn from that? And so we wanted to offer young adults at that time a different space and a different opening to ask those questions and look inward and then figure out how to support each other and not having to have all of the answers to the questions, but to help provide other questions and support. And so the Quaker tradition both has the theology of there is an inner teacher or wisdom, or there is that of God in every person. And part of what we learn through the Quaker practices, through waiting worship, which might be worship in silence, through different sort of tools like a Clearness Committee, which we can talk about later too, that we can use those tools to kind of understand and shape and tap into that part of ourselves, that spiritual part of ourselves. And so as we think about this for an intergenerational community, which we found when we were running this program for young adults at their colleges and at Quaker meetings adjacent to them, we found a lot of folks at the stage of life, sort of right on either the precipice of retirement or mid-retirement, asking really similar questions and holding them and not having a lot of space to actively talk about them. And so things like, how do I know when I need to lay down a commitment that I have and move into something else? Or how do I know when I'm launched into the unknown, what my right next steps are? Given a lot of advice and a lot of marketing to us about how we might choose that next step. And so we found that creating a peer support around that with those questions rooted in those Quaker values of you have some wisdom inside of you and we can teach you some things that might help you tap into that as part of where we root this curriculum. And I'll stop talking there and see if others want to add depth to this.
I would just say that sometimes we don't realize how valuable community is in our discernment process until we actually engage that community. Because sometimes our personal viewpoint gets trapped inside our own lens or our own context. And so we kind of cycle through the same questions and um, the same barriers that we've placed around our own understanding of like what is possible. And so when other people approach our question or our query with their lens and their context, it can open up an entirely new perspective that we never even imagined. And so the Quaker process of finding clarity is so valuable within and beyond the Quaker community because it uses some real practical methods of tapping into the community that we have access to and allowing that blend of contexts and blend of perspectives to inform our next steps.
Greg, is there anything you'd like to add?
In the past couple years, I've been doing a lot of somatic work through through my own journey with therapy and through other groups and something I really liked about Quakerism and Quaker practice idea is that in uh our body knows the wisdom we need. So our program isn't about giving answers, but allowing people to tap into themselves. And because we live in a world that really uh, uh, doesn't value people being connected to their like mind, body, spirit. So how can we like ground that and help people reach back inside them for the wisdom that they hold?
I'm thinking so much about, it's hard not to myself, and how throughout life, you're often expected to have all the answers or expected to know what your path is, and not knowing can be so scary, and admitting that. So the fact that what you're all talking about is that, in a sense, you have the answer inside. What you are all providing with the Quaker Vocational Discernment is a framework and some tools to help individuals get to those answers that are already lying within themselves. So that's just what I'm reflecting on. So, Jen, you had brought up a Clearness Committee. And I think that may be a new term for anyone out there listening. So I would love to hear more about that, especially how it helps with this vocational discernment process or finding one's own purpose.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. So clearness committees, clearness like clearness. I've heard it also described as a clearance committee once by someone. So I'm going to be clear that I'm saying clearance. I'm saying clearness. And the idea is that we have big questions in our lives. It might mean, do I become a member of my Quaker meeting? It might mean, do I get married? It might mean, do I take this job, or how do I navigate this thing? And so Quakers have a process that it opens up room for group discernment to help a focused person in a clearness committee arrive at some sense of clarity about what their right next step is given a question. It could mean, what is my ministry? What do I call it? It could mean, there are lots of questions that you might bring that don't necessarily have a clear, obvious right answer, but that have multiple possible ways forward, or you might not even have clarity about what those ways forward are. And so you can bring a community of people, usually 3 or 4 others, to sit with you and ask you questions that help you go deeper in your own discernment. So I'll use an example from my own life. But when I have lots of them, but for example, I'll use a college one. So in college, I got into divinity school and law school. There are 2 very different paths there. And I could have decided neither of those things. And one was like, this is what I always thought I would do. And one was like, divinity school is like, I'm not sure about this. And so in that instance, I might call a clearness committee to help me explore where am I called? Where am I drawn? Both options could be opening different things in my own life. So that's an example of having 2 very concrete options that you're exploring, that you're really narrowed down to, but you'd like to explore. I used clearness committees as I thought about whether or not I took the executive director position at Beacon Hill Friends House, whether or not that was the path that I wanted to take here, or did I want to explore something else? And so there an option was presented in front of me. My predecessor was leaving the role, and I had to think about, is this the right next step for me, or is there some other path forward? And so those are 2 examples where you might have a really clear next step. Other examples might feel more like there's a fog in front of you. We might call that fog clearing. So you might not know exactly where you're headed forward, but something isn't right about where you are now. And so you might bring folks around you to help you explore, what general direction am I moving in, and to hold it with you. And so a group of the practical matter of it is that a focused person might call a group of 3 or 4 people to come sit with them. They may share a particular question, like the ones that I've been offering, around testing is this the right way forward for me, or do I take this option or this one? They might say, I'm not sure where I'm going, but they would offer a question and some background information to those folks. And then the role of the members of the Clearness Committee isn't to decide necessarily what this person does next, but is to offer questions that are exploratory, that are open, that help someone go deeper. So if I was choosing between divinity school and law school, you might say, a question might look like, what is your heart longing for in the next 2 years of your life? And that might open up some questions for me that I was not, expecting to think about. Or it might mean like, tell us an example of where you felt joy as you explored the idea of being an executive director. Or tell us what are some of the fears that you're holding about taking that as your next step? Where might you see other ways opening? And how might you name them? And so those questions are not meant to guide someone in a particular way, but to help open up room for exploring. In a clearness committee, you might meet for an hour and a half. You might meet for an hour over and over and over again until that person gets what they need out of it and all the parties are consenting to those long meetings. And it's a way for community members to really show up and listen. So other things members of a clearness committee could do would be to reflect back what they're hearing. They might be to offer images or thoughts that are coming to mind when they listen to what that person is sharing. Some folks who like prayer might ask the committee to explore prayer with them or other spiritual practices in that moment to help open things up. And so it's really wide ranging depending on what the focus person is and the group is comfortable with exploring. But the goal is to help that person, like Brent was sharing, in community, go deeper with these questions and not feel alone in holding them. And so it's, I think, a really great way that folks can show up in exploring these things with each other in community.
Brent and Greg, is there anything that you might like to add at this point?
I was just going to add to what Jen was saying by pointing out that the Clearness Committee is often focused on the person who is presenting the query, who is asking the question. But one of the things that I found surprising about a Clearness Committee is how much it actually helps the participants who are asking the questions, because in a Clearness Committee, there is typically a clerk who will kind of oversee the process. And one of the functions of the clerk is to make sure that the questions being asked are not cloaked as advice. For instance, have you thought about applying to this organization, or have you thought about volunteering in this way? That is all about advice. And what participants can glean from participating in a Clearness Committee and having those questions reframed to be actually more effective for the querent is they find that it affects how they ask questions to other people in their lives outside of a Clearness Committee. They realize that they've been offering these advice type questions to their kids or to their colleagues, and it can really help to instruct or inform how we move forward with offering a guidance or assistance to our communities outside the Clearness Committee. And so there are multiple benefits that I find that a Clearness Committee offers, not only for the person who is seeking discernment, but also for people who are helping in that process.
Would you prefer to age independently in your own home or live in a nursing facility? I know what I'd rather do. Friends Life Care membership offers just that. Plan today for a future lived at home with vitality, independence, growth, and resilience while protecting your savings. Learn about your options at a free seminar or webinar. Register at friendslifecare.org/register or call 215-628-8964. I so often find myself, especially with my children, doing the cloaking advice questions, and I don't even realize that I'm doing it. So this conversation is absolutely going to help me show up differently in some future interactions when I cannot, maybe I'll just be able to at least catch myself a little bit better in those interactions. So I'm thinking all of this sounds very poignant, and I'd love to go out there and do it today. I wonder, however, what fears that you might see older adults that you're running this program with who are coming for a clearness committee about vocational discernment. What are some of the fears that they're facing either coming in or during this process?
One of the things that I have been very aware of when I have talked to people who are moving into this very unfamiliar and disorienting phase of life, and I've noticed it with my own family, my own parents, who one of their biggest fears is uh, cognitive decline,
Mhm.
um, because of the awareness that as we get older, sometimes we lose some of the sharpness, or in some cases, some people lose some of the sharpness that they knew when they were actively working inside their career, whatever that career was. Um, and so there's this shift and this fear that if I don't stay in my career, then I'm going to lose this cognitive sharpness, that I have enjoyed all of these years. And I think one of the questions that I've heard older adults ask is, how do I maintain the how do I maintain the clarity that I have around that I have typically had around life when I am moving into such an uncharted place in my life. And so part of that, I think, is this concern that I'm not going to have opportunities to challenge my mind in ways that will keep me sharp. And so part of this discernment process is, what does that look like for me? What will help me maintain the kind of sharpness that I want in my future? And I think um, the answer is going to be different for everyone. And so it's not just a cookie cutter answer. You can't just download an app and be guaranteed to have all of the results that you're looking for. You really have to discern what is going to facilitate that continued cognitive journey that you're on.
I think that is an excellent example of what the people going through your vocational discernment, the types of questions that they may bring. Are there any other stories or examples or questions that you've seen success with running this vocational discernment program with older adults?
Looks like Greg is deep in thought. Greg, do you want to go next?
Yeah, to be quite honest, that part of the work is newer, but almost, but we have had we have had many workshops that were multi-generational that
Mm.
we had one where the youngest person was 16 and the oldest were almost 80. And even in and the youngest and the oldest participant just happened to be in the same clearness committees. And afterwards, the participant who was in their 70s was that Oh, the teen asked me a question I never even thought about. So I think I think people are amazed at how even if they go in thinking that they know what the answer will be, they will be surprised at more than not. People are surprised by the questions they are asked and things that are coming up, and it's a way to awaken their passions, and I think that I think especially for older adults, there is a time to help them reconnect with a interest or interests they might have had to put aside at a younger age. I think of the example of Gamma Moses, who began painting, picked up painting again at the decades, like in those 70s after she was widowed. And but the time she died at 101, she was one of the most famous painters of her time. So it was, and now paintings are in some of the are in art galleries and museums all over the world. And she picked up painting again at the age of, I think, 78. Yeah. So that was in the late 30s. And she died in 1961. So I think it's never too late to we discover a passion.
Yeah, I can briefly also respond that on the piece about what are people fearing. Again, in my experience with our workshops, both intergenerational ones and ones geared toward this age range alone, the fears I hear are the overwhelm of the question of what is mine to do. Like, how do I even know what's next? And there's a lot of information coming at you. And the fear of the unknown as things keep changing and transitions or change gets kind of acute with aging. That, how will you know and how will you navigate it are big questions. But I also have experienced a real deep eagerness for folks to engage in these conversations. And so hearing from folks this both like, I'm really afraid to go this deep, but I'm here and I'm super eager and I want to, has been my experience with this age range. So both a desire to go really deep and a fear of what that will unearth. And we did do a survey of folks that we had, I think, over 50 responses to of folks ages 55 to 89 about what questions they were asking, which in part really inspired us to focus in on this new part of our work with this curriculum. And a lot of those questions were along those lines. So things like, how do I integrate all I have done in my life to create a meaningful way forward? Will my work be a necessity in terms of how to afford to grow older in this country? What is mine to do as I slow down into retirement? Is simply enjoying life enough? What do I have inside me to give back to others in my elder years? As I contemplate retirement, how will I find meaningful activity Can I transition to a new career that is personally fulfilling now that I don't need to worry about money? Or now that I'm retired, where am I called to bring light? And someone wrote, now what? And then wrote a little bit about their life story and how they arrived at this moment and the overwhelm of the question of now what. And I'll read one more, which is this, how echoes what Brent was sharing, but what can I do at this stage of my life when I feel physically and sometimes mentally limited? How can I connect with those outside my age group or other demographic categories? And so there were a lot of deep questions. We asked an open-ended one, which was just, what questions are you holding about vocation in this season of your life? And they went wide-ranging and deep. And so our experience has been, the fear is often in what will happen when I open up space for this question, but also a deep yearning for those pure spaces.
If I can just add one more thing about what Jen was just saying in some of those questions. One situation that I'm aware of is that of a professor who retired and realized that his entire life he had been offering expertise and mentorship to students. And one of the things that he wasn't clear about in his retirement is how many people are going to be coming around asking for my insight, asking for my expertise. And so there was this fear of isolation or loneliness. But I think it comes from this deep-seated human need for contribution. We want to contribute, and contribution is defined differently by everyone. And so in his career, he spent decades contributing by helping to mentor younger people. But now it was struggling to figure out, like, where is my place now for that kind of contribution? And so finding that path might seem as simple as, volunteering somewhere, but it really is very individual for each person to figure out, what does contribution look like for me now, and who is going to want to know what I have to offer.
And I appreciate all the questions that were coming up for me that you inadvertently answered, where I was curious, who should we invite to a clearness committee? And I loved Greg's example of, well, we have anywhere from a 16-year-old to somebody all the way into their 80s. And how interesting it would be to hear the questions from people who are at all different points of their aging journey. Also, I loved never too late. And with age comes experience. And I think it is so common to have a fear of the unknown. Now, there's going to be some people who are very excited by the unknown. I'm not necessarily one of them. So just like it's normal to fear the unknown, regardless of how old you are. So just bringing that to the forefront, that you're not alone out there if you are having some fear or worry around what's next for you. So me hearing all this, I want to set up my own clearness committee. I have questions that I would love to have answered, and I'm thinking some of our listeners will be thinking the same thing. So for that group who's curious and they want to explore this further, how might you suggest someone could begin this process of Quaker vocational discernment?
Well, we are working on releasing a workbook and resource that will be released sometime in early 2025, I think. But I would think about, what are the questions that you're holding and how can you write them down? Is there a place that you can kind of think about them, get quiet, articulate them? And are there 3 or 4 other people who you might want to be in conversation with about those questions? What are those spaces that you can open up to ask those? Are there others that are holding questions that you could support? So think about where there might be folks who are eager for that conversation, but that you haven't identified yet in your life? And can you identify some of those conversation partners? Might be where I would start.
Any guidance from you, Greg, or you, Brent?
There is Pendle Hill has pamphlets that will often answer specific, or address certain topics. And there are some, like, for instance, there's one called the Clearness Committee, A Communal Approach to Discernment by Parker Palmer. There are other opportunities where you can actually look specifically for instruction about how to do a clearness committee. And so there are some resources online. There's some pamphlets available through Pendle Hill. And there's, also people who are familiar with Quaker process will also inevitably have some thoughts about, where to find good resources for learning the Quaker processes around clearness committees and other parts of discernment. So fortunately, with the internet these days, we do have access to quite a wealth of resources around how to actually put together and run a clearness committee for yourself. But we hope to be one of those resources very, very, very soon.
One of the advantages of doing a clearness committee with people is you could you can become spiritual account you can become spiritual accountability partners, so that you don't lose the momentum from that clearness committee, and you can check in with the people on the committee, or maybe just one person on the committee to kind of hold you accountable. I think part of the reason that we are so far into this project, Jen and I showed as accountability partners with each other to keep this going. Despite not living in the same area, despite our busy schedule and not being the one thing we can focus all our time on. So.
So before we close, I would like to invite you to share more about the vocational discernment program that you're going to be leading for Friends Life Care members.
Sure. We are still working on figuring out the dates for this program, so stay tuned for more information. But our intention is to have it on site at the location of Friends Life Care. And Cheryl, can you remind folks of where that on-site location is?
Sure, we're 460 Norristown Road, Suite 300, and that's in Bluebell, Pennsylvania.
Great. And we are exploring conversations about having this as a hybrid program, or offering an online option. So if folks are interested in engaging but can't make it to, is it Bluebell, Pennsylvania?
You got it.
Then I encourage you to reach out to Cheryl or others at Friends Life Care to express your interest in that program. So stay tuned for more information, which will be coming shortly.
So, in closing, I would like to go around again and see if there's any advice that you would like to give to older adults who are feeling that uncertainty that I was mentioning before, the uncertainty about what comes next in their lives.
I would just like to challenge folks to examine what they have gleaned from their life so far and decide what is important to them to take forward and what is important to them to lay down. And laying something down does not mean dismissing it or invalidating the lessons learned through something, but sometimes um, knowing what we want in the future is 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 it's important to know what we don't want from the past to move into our future. Um, so being honest about that and allowing ourselves the permission to lay things down that have really served us in the past, but are have come to perhaps the end of the shelf life for that particular thing, to be able to be clear and honest and vulnerable about what we are ready to lay down and what we really want to make space for in the future. I think that is a really important part to not only coming up with some answers, but also coming up with some good questions to help us, discover further what's important to us.
I guess my advice would just be that there are ways to cultivate community around holding these questions. So there's not necessarily easy answers or immediate answers, but there are ways that we can bring people alongside us to hold those questions. And our workshop is one of those places where you might find that, but there are other places in your life and conversation partners you can bring in.
I think in our culture, we live in a time of a lot of loneliness. So I think the biggest thing I want to always remind people is you are not alone. You have a community. You have people who want to support you, and sometimes it can be hard to think about who those are, but I believe everyone has people in their lives who are willing to support them.
Jen, Greg, and Brent, thank you so much for joining me today and allowing us to explore vocational discernment, especially as it relates to older adults and Quakerism. And I know the Friends Life Care members will benefit so much from the program that you'll all be leading with us in 2025. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Gerald.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Honestly Aging by Friends Life Care VigR, a unique program focused on aging with vitality, independence, growth, and resilience. You can find links and show notes from this episode on our website at friendslifecare.org/podcast. Thank you to Jen Newman, Greg Woods, and Brent Walsh for joining us today. You can learn more about Jen, Greg, Brent, and Beacon Hill Friends House by visiting bhfh.org, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And thank you to Nick Dieterding for editing all the Honestly Aging episodes. If you like our show, please rate, review, subscribe, and join us next time. To learn more about aging with vitality, independence, growth, and resilience, subscribe to our blog at friendslifecare.org/blog.